Right. Amanda, I'm going to ask you to, oh, I think you're already spotlighted. I'm sorry.
And I almost told you to switch it.
Right.
That would have been, you're much more lovely than myself, so that's grand.
So I'm super excited some of you may know me from St. Mary's, some of you may know me from my time at DeSales, but I'm Amanda Conklin. I'm the campus minister at St. Mary's, and I'm super excited to introduce a man of many talents. Some of you may know him from his time teaching at DeSales. Some of you may know him from his time teaching in Allentown, studying at Berkeley for one of his many degrees that he has, or maybe even writing for Magnificat. And maybe most recently being a priest for the Diocese of Brooklyn and his work with DeSales Media. And maybe you know him for the other talents that we love him for, like being the DJ at our wedding. Or, as he already mentioned, he is our daughter Emma's godfather. And he may be Bob Dylan's biggest fan as well. So he is part owner of the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm, which we're going to talk a little bit more about next week. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce someone who's basically part of our family, Father John Gribowich, affectionately known as Grib. So take it away.
Right.
Can you spotlight him now, Father? So there we go.
Thank you so much, guys, for that really nice introduction. I mean, you forgot to mention that I'm also a guy who likes to have more than a few Yingling lagers too. So thanks for making it a little bit more PG. Anyway, it's great to be here with you guys. I think that the way I like to maybe do this format here is that maybe spend about speaking for approximately 20 minutes, and then we'll just open up for questions. And I hope that I can stay at 20 minutes. One of the problems of priests is that they never know when to stop talking. So, and I know I'm guilty as charged with that. So I will try my best to stay within that framework. And also, I know that this has always been a casual gathering for you, especially when you were meeting in person. And I guess it's even probably more casual now that we're all in our own living rooms or the comforts of our homes. So I intend to make this talk very casual too. And how I like to do that is just by making it very personal. And I think that's the best way for me to do this, because I don't need to be telling you what to do or lecturing you or giving you some type of grand theological exposition on something. I think that our own experiences can sometimes be the best way to kind of tap into what other people's experiences are. And hopefully that will generate some great discussions tonight. So the theme here is to really look upon my recent time that I spent at a Trappist monastery in upstate New York and relate that time to the enforced monasticism, I guess you want to say, that we are in right now, this de facto monasticism that we're in. And I think I want to just kind of break up this conversation in three ways. I want to be able to, by the way, I just got a text saying there's no way I can stay within 20 minutes. So now I'm being challenged. That's great. That's great. It's always great to have people that you love on these calls. All right. So the thing is that there are three things I want to kind of maybe touch on. Like, what drew me to wanting to go into the monastery for that trial time, so to speak. What happened in the monastery, and basically how have I been able to live out this experience of being in the monastery in this current state that we're in right now. So that's the three components I just want to kind of walk through here. My attraction to monastic life actually begins, maybe in a very ironic way or a paradoxical way, with serving the poor. I had a great love for exploring what it meant to be homeless, what it meant to be on the streets, just what it meant to be down and out in society. And I think that during my time in high school is when I really start to explore that more so by spending a lot of time working in a soup kitchen and shelter in Philadelphia, known as the St. Francis Inn. And I think that while maybe a lot of my motivation for doing that was because I wanted to do something good or give back to society or try to make a difference, so to speak, I quickly realized that I was in the presence of something bigger than myself when I was dealing with listening to the complexities and the stories of people, how they live their life, what happened to them, why they are the way they are right now, what led them to be on the streets. And that is really what I think sparked a contemplative side of me, where I just desire to be more of listening to what was going on than trying to figure out how to solve it. And as I went through college, I would say that another component came in my study of theology, because during that time I started to read about so much of the mystical tradition within the church. And I was also able to understand how we can look at acts of social justice, not just simply as ways of being charitable, but way of actually participating in the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. So there became a real big theological, academic, intellectual component to this. And I think more recently, what also brought this on was just a great type of dissatisfaction with how things were going in the world. Just really feeling that we're just so much on the wrong track in so many ways, and our priorities are so out of whack that this desire to try to look for something more countercultural, or this desire to be part of a renewal in the world, that's what really led me to the monastery. So I would look at those that progression. And I think my time in Berkeley, for example, was a great time where a lot of these things start to kind of come together, because I was still very much engaged in working with the poor during my time out there. Of course, I was being very much academically challenged by my studies. And I was also just realizing that there were so many people searching for happiness and having a hard time really finding it. And I think a lot of people were trying their best to create their own identity, try to find really what their whole purpose for living is. And I could tell that that was a very futile search, actually, because of the fact that, like, whenever we seem to gain what we think is going to make us happy, we always just want more or something different. We get bored. So, the whole Berkeley experience, I think, was put the nail in the coffin, so to speak, of taking me into the monastery, where I would, in a certain sense, be dying to self. And that's what really challenged me to want to explore that life. And the thing about monasticism is that while all my intentions of going there were, I guess you want to say, if anything, not bad reasons for going there, what a monastic is very different than maybe what we think. And I already kind of understood that a lot going there, because of just so much reading I did by monastic writers. I should also say that one of the books that really influenced me the most over the last 10 years was actually a fairly newer book written by a guy who lives here in Brooklyn. His name's Paul Eli, and he wrote a book called The Life You Saved May Be Your Own. And he does an exposition, a biographical exposition on Dorothy Day, who I already had a great devotion to, but also the novelist Walker Percy and Flannery O'Connor, known for her short stories, and Thomas Merton. And I think that by reading all this monastic literature, especially from Merton, I had a good idea of what to expect in the monastery. But when I was actually there, so this is part 2 of my talk, when I was actually there, I realized that the monastery is not a place where you think you're going to escape the world in a radical way. The monastery was still very much connected to society. We had access to email and things like that. And it was also very much connected to just if you want to say, the economy of society. In order to survive, it had a massive bakery. And so really the whole operation was dependent upon consumers, is dependent upon marketing, it's dependent upon all these things, which I learned in business school, actually. So it wasn't as if I somehow left Berkeley and I left the business school that I was studying to enter into a world where that was not important. In fact, I saw how it was very important in the monastery, because it was a very, very highly super localized economic system, in that partnerships that were formed between the monastery and local outlets for the distribution of their products was essential. And you could just see how the monastery was very much connected to the world. It was not just somehow you were going into a place of nowhere. It was in a very more isolated area, but it was still very well connected. And the other thing too about the monastery that would be very maybe a big surprise to people, is that many people think that monks are praying for the world, like they're this big band of intercessors, just praying that war would cease, and praying that peoples would be returned to health and things like that. And clearly, there is a expression of intercessory prayer that happens in monasteries, most especially during public worship. But that's really not the point of being a monk, is to be praying for other people. The point of the monk is to offer praise to God, and that's it. To become so detached from your own needs, your own concerns, and even the concerns of others, that the only thing that you offer is praise to God. And this becomes what we would call a sacrifice of praise. And by giving God that praise, we then essentially assume that God takes our praise and does what he wants with it. So it's a way actually of giving God permission to do what he wills in the world. And that's essentially how the most dynamic relationship that the monastic has with the world, because of the fact that we allow God to do what he wills, rather than telling God what he should do or hoping that God does something. It's essentially creating space to become so detached from even having good intentions, to allowing God's will to be known. And it's all done through an act of praise, an act of love. And also, the thing to keep in mind too is that the monks, there were close to 30 monks I was living with. I mean, this is the same type of dynamic that you have in any other type of community. I mean, there were people all over the map when it came to ideas about politics or ideas about theology. There were people all over the map about with different personalities or traits like that. So there was no cookie cutter type of monk. Everyone, it was a microcosm of in lots of ways of everything that we experience in the world. So the other thing to understand is that community living, it's often thought about as being difficult, but it was also looked upon as an opportunity to grow in the awareness of how to deal with your own self, so that you know how to deal with other people. And I think that's what I want to say I took away from the monastery. And it's also has prepared me for the time that we're in. So the takeaways, this will be the third part of this introduction here, is that, there are a couple things I would say really stuck with me, and I think have become even more important as we are in this time of staying at home, this time of monasticism that we're in. One was, first off, as I was saying, community life. How do we understand our relationship to other people? And it often is not always about wanting other people to change, but how can we change ourselves in order to maybe deal with the idiosyncrasies of another, or with things that we strongly disagree with. I mean, there were clearly monks that I was even living with. I was like, I don't understand why this guy's here. This guy is so annoying. I don't see where the love of God is in this person. Anything like that. And to come to a realization that even in this person, you're able to access in a very real way the presence of Christ. So it's all about trying to be open to that, rather than trying to expect someone to act a different way or think that they should act a different way. So that was one big takeaway. And I think that that's something that I can definitely say I've experienced more even now, in the very impersonal type of communications that we have through Zoom calls and things like that. Because a lot of times, especially like when we turn the camera off, it gives us more freedom to maybe be a little bit more loose with how we're acting or what we want to say, or with the amount of emails that go back and forth. We know that a lot of people will say certain things that just drive us crazy. So that's one way of being able to deal with this constant technological communication within the community that we're in. Was definitely something I was able to experience living in the personal community of the monastery. But the big thing, and this is the thing I really want to kind of hit hard with tonight, is that the monastery, with its rhythm, did two things. First off, it put things in proper order. So like I said, it was still very much connected to the world, but things had a proper order, and they had a proper time and a proper place. That's something that I think we could all say we struggle with. I mean, we all realize there's things that are not balanced in our life, that we're on the phone too much, or that we watch TV too much, or we even read too much, or we may even be praying too much. I mean, all these types of things, we can have things that are like not in the proper order. But the regiment of the monastery, with the bell going off at 3:15 every morning, and knowing that you're in the chapel at 3:30, and then all the other time, I mean, the bell went off, I think, about 40 times a day. It helped to realize that certain things have a time and a place, and then they come to a conclusion, and then you do something else. So that whole discipline of realizing that there are many good things in the world, but the way that we're able to understand them as being good is when we are able to have them have a particular integrity at a particular moment in time. And that was one thing that I think is something that we could learn today, right now, because we have to be able to know how to understand how much time we're devoting to certain things when we seem to have like more time on our hands than normal, or there's certain things that have been taken away, like such as commute time. So now we have to understand, what are we putting in place of our commute? So there's that. And the other big thing was just that the rhythm of the prayer, the time working in the monastery, which was very manual, repetitive work, it allowed and facilitated your mind to go all over the place. Your thoughts became so prominent. And I found myself just thinking about so many things, especially thinking about things in my past that I had not thought about in a very long time, thinking about relationships with different people who I've not thought about in a long time. And it was absolutely amazing how many things would be coming to your mind. And this wasn't just like idle daydreaming about things. It was really just coming to a reckoning with like, oh my gosh, like certain things maybe were not resolved in my life, or certain things I just never really understood how thankful I was for that moment in time, or certain types of relationships I didn't appreciate for what they were, or certain relationships I didn't realize how harmful they were. All these things start to come up in the monastic regiment. And because I was often wondering when I talked to monks, you know, how exactly does this life really transform you? Or like, how do you know you're called to live this life? And they would all kind of say, oh, you'll just know. And it was very true, because of the fact that you didn't need to be spending extensive time in spiritual direction or in therapy to be able to come to an awareness that there's a lot of things happening in your head that really are the origin of so much of our behavior. And I found myself, because I was trying to go, I think I was trying to even go to confession every week there, that what I was confessing in my confessions were not necessary actions, but were thoughts. And I know that we're often under this illusion that our thoughts really aren't that bad. I mean, it's what you do, it's not, what you're thinking. But if we don't really see that there's a connection between our actions and our thoughts, and I think we have a very difficult time trying to maybe correct or try to change our habits or our actions. So for me, the dwelling with my thoughts and being able to ask Jesus really to come into my thoughts and to revisit things, especially from my past, but to try to affirm who I really was at that moment in light of who I am in my relationship with Christ. I really do believe that, especially sacramentally, we are in union with Christ at all times. When we say that we're beloved sons and daughters of God, it's only because Jesus is the beloved Son of God, and we share in a communion, a participation with Christ. So in these moments in my past where that clearly was not on the radar, revisiting the past and putting that on the radar back in time was a great means for healing in those moments in the past. To realize that the same God who loves me today was the same God who loved me back then. The same Christ who I have a participation with now was the same Christ I had a participation with then, even without maybe being aware of it or being able to really draw the fruit from that. So that was a big thing. And I think just to kind of end this portion here and to open up for questions, because I love to just hear what you guys are thinking, is that right now I would say that we are living in a Holy Saturday moment. We're living in the tomb. Our life was one way before, and our life is going to be some other way whenever that time comes. But right now we're in this transitional moment, and we don't know how long we're going to be in the tomb. This is what a lot of spiritual writers would say is the liminal space, a time where we have to let go of certain things, but you're letting go so that you're making room in order to receive something new. So that is exactly what the tomb is all about. And I think that being in the tomb, there are certain types of things that we can do to use this time well in the tomb. And what I would say are three things. Number one, like I was kind of saying here, and this is something that I'm really still wrestling with here, is how to make sense of our thoughts, how we understand, why we're thinking what we're thinking, but more importantly, when we start acting certain ways, to quickly ask ourselves, why do we feel it's so important to act this way? If we're angry for some reason, why do we feel it's so important to be angry about this particular thing right now? All those types of things, to really understand what is the result of our action. And usually if we start to be okay with our thoughts and be comfortable in just delving through them, we could start to see really where are the dots connecting. And that requires a great deal of silence and solitude. So I think that to carve out the times to be silent is the time to just be okay with our thoughts. I know that many of us, when we pray, especially if we're trying to be really meditative when we pray, we kind of feel like our thoughts are distraction. And we feel like we can never really get in the groove because our mind is going a million miles an hour. Well, right now, I mean, like I'm at a point where it's like I'm totally okay if my mind is going a million miles an hour, because in a certain sense, that is just where what God wants me to be with, where that's where God wants me to bring him to. He wants me to be able to offer my mind going a million miles an hour. It's not about me just trying to clear up headspace. It's about just saying, okay, why am I thinking about this? Why is this so important? Why do I keep on obsessing about this? And just kind of interiorly asking myself those questions as I'm going through these thoughts is bringing God into this moment. Secondly, about being in the tomb, it's a moment to be honest in our prayer too. So while we can be first okay with our thoughts, secondly, to be honest with our prayer. And I think the best way to be honest with our prayer is by reading the Psalms, because as inspired as the Psalms are from being in the Bible, you can also see the personality of the writers of these Psalms. I mean, these are people who were just really frustrated with certain things. And there's great allusions to the different things that we deal with now, like plagues and things like that. I mean, war and violence and everything like that. I mean, the plague, of course, is the most prominent thing that we're dealing with right now. And there's a great frustration that the psalmists have. And we think of like the great Psalm of 22, Christ yells on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? But the great thing about the Psalms is, as honest as they are in their prayer and as frustrated they are with God, there's also a resolution in the Psalms where the psalmist, in a certain sense, is working through his issue with God by coming to the realization, like, oh, wait a minute, you're God and I'm not. And to God be all the praise. And that's the beauty of the Psalms, is that they allow us to just kind of eventually empty ourselves of our frustration, because we realize that, oh, we're really just not in control. And lastly, I would say that right now during this time in the tomb, it's great to cultivate some type of meaningful devotion to Mary, the mother of Christ. And I don't mean this in some type of pietistical way where you just need to be praying more rosaries or things like that. Although ironically, when I was in the monastery, I did do a reconsecration to the Blessed Mother, which is a very traditional thing that certain Catholics do. But right now, I think that if there's anyone who had a faith that lasted past Good Friday, of course, it was Mary, the mother of Christ. And to cultivate some type of relationship with her, and in whatever type of way that makes sense. If the rosary is not making sense, don't force it. It may be that you have to just read maybe a really good book on Mary, or watch a really good movie. Now, granted, I think there's a lot of cheesy Catholic stuff out there, but hopefully there could be something that can help you to understand more about the mother of Jesus, because if we want to talk about how to be a contemplative, we have to look to her. And there's a reason why the church will devote Saturdays as a days to honor Mary, because of the fact that her faith was still there in the tomb on Holy Saturday. And so I actually have some books here that I can suggest to help us through this too. But I do think that it's important right now to walk through this time in a certain sense with Mary, knowing that she has walked this already, She walked this by following her son to the crucifixion. She was essentially waiting anxiously as to what was going to happen after his death, realizing that somehow that was not the end of the story. And that's the great inspiration for us now, to be waiting with her for something far greater to come. And I really do believe that we are meant to experience resurrection in the here and now. It's not just simply our time being freed in heaven, that we are able to realize that we constantly are dying to ourselves, dying to our old ways, detaching ourselves from certain things to then receive newness, which gives us a resurrection experience. But the whole process of leaving and creating room to receive, that is the thing that we don't like. And that's why we probably don't like this time so much. So that's my introduction. I don't know how far I went. Yeah, of course, it's a little bit over 20 minutes, but I think we have a half hour for some questions. So I'll open up for you guys.
Other group, thank you so much. Outstanding. Really appreciate taking us all the way through little personal experiences there from your time. I think everybody knew beforehand, but it was 3 months, right, that you were there in the monastery?
Yeah, just under 3 months. Mm-hmm.
Months, yeah. And so having that vision is huge. The idea of entering into the tomb, and I think that's one that just stands out so clearly as like that we don't. There's been a lot of discussion I've been hearing about not wanting to go back. Some people have been saying over and over again, I can't wait for things to get back to normal. And I think some people a little bit more reflective are saying, I don't think I want to just go back. I want there to be something different. And I think that you've given, just by opening up the tomb image for me, that's a very, very powerful one. Is there something more that you could share about that tomb image? Where'd you want to share that with us?
Well, I think it really hit me this Holy Saturday when we were experiencing Holy Week in a very different way. I think that there's something about the tomb that's also connected to what spiritual writers like John of the Cross would say of the dark night. And you know, when people hear about the dark night, a lot of times they think of that as being some type of test, that, like, you know, you're going through a really trying time and God's trying and to see how strong your faith is and all that. And the reality is that, like, the dark night, especially for a writer like John of the Cross, that was like the ideal time to be in. It was not like looked upon as being a problematic time. It's like you want to be in the dark night, because at that point, everything is so dark that the only thing that you have is your relationship with God to see you through. And I think that also the dark night really expands our desire for God. And if there's one thing that I think that this time allows us in the tomb, is the desire for life, or the desire for newness, grows. And we can trust our inner desire. And that, I think, is proof of God's love for us, the very fact that we desire something that's so far greater than what we could imagine. So I think that this darkness, this being in the tomb, is this place of just expanding our desire for God, because there's nothing else that can fill it that would make our time here more more meaningful or better in some way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, the space of the tomb. I forget who gives that image of just making space for God in our lives. I've heard so many people just say that they need to slow down, and it feels like God has asked us to slow down. Before I get into some of the questions that have come in, just a reminder for folks: there's a little chat box there at the bottom. Feel free to type in questions. if you'd like to speak a question, just raise your hand first, and then I'll call on you. I'll sort of moderate things here for folks. The one, you already set yourself up for it, Father John, but Leah asks, what movie or book for Mary is good? I don't think she's looking for recommendations for Mary to watch. I think it's recommendations like about Mary.
Recommendations about Mary. Well, you know, I'm really captivated by this book here. I picked very small books.
Nice.
Because to not intimidate. But this is a book that came out right around the year 2000. It's called Our Lady of Holy Saturday. And it was written by, well, he's now deceased, but the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan, Cardinal Martini. And this book here, I think, is really, I was reading this, I usually read it most Holy Saturdays as just part of my meditation, but it just hit me and it struck me in such a profound way. So this might be something good to kind of, because it's a great, excellent reflection on Mary in context of where she was on Holy Saturday. So that's one suggestion I have. Do you want me to give more suggestions? But I mean, that's the one, that's the big one. So.
Ironically, the little one. Didn't you mention you had a number of books there, or did I mishear you?
Yeah. So I mentioned to you a very big life-changing book for me. Now this is a bigger book. This is The Life You Saved May Be Your Own, which is actually the title of a Flannery O'Connor short story. But Paul Elie, he really did this great job at looking at these four contemporary Catholics from the 20th century: Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, and just creates this amazing interbiographical narrative. I think I've read this now 3 times from beginning to end, because it came to me at the right time in my life. I think it was in my mid-20s when I read it, and it brought me to a mature level of faith, because I don't think that most Catholics understand really what these prophetic voices in the 20th century mean for our time right now. I think some of them have been written off, or a lot of people have thought that they were just on the fringes, or they were, just somehow not with mainstream Catholicism. And that's all true, but that's really where the prophets always are. They're always somewhere on the fringes, somewhere outside of the mainstream. And I think my own prophetic pulse, I think, was being fed by reading this book. And then also, this book here is one that I recommend to people when they ask me for spiritual direction. I say, well, I'm not going to say yes to spiritual direction for you unless you read at least part of this book, and then we can discuss it, and then we can go from there. And it's written by this Jesuit, William Barry. It's called Praying the Truth. This is another small book. This came out about 8 years ago now. And if we're going to talk about how to deal with our thoughts and how we can pray our thoughts, I mean, the subtitle here is Deepening Your Friendship with God Through Honest Prayer. This guy does a great job in just allowing ourselves to be vulnerable with God, because only by being vulnerable with God can we actually be aware of how vulnerable God is with us. I mean, just how, I used to often say, I mean, we have a God who's so vulnerable that he becomes what appears to be bread and wine, which is breakable and spillable, right? I mean, like that's how vulnerable God is with us. So vulnerability meeting vulnerability is where a true communion takes place. And that can happen now as we deal with our thoughts during this time where we just have more time to be thinking. And I think this book helps us along the way. And I think those are the main ones I wanted to share with you.
I would definitely, I'm not familiar with Praying the Truth, but Barry's book was used, I'm blanking on the other title, but another of his books was used in the IPF Spiritual Direction Program. His stuff is really excellent. And The Life You Saved May Be Your Own. I forget when I read that one, but just unpacked those authors in such beautiful ways. There are phrases that most books come and go, but there are phrases and images that really fleshed out Catholicism. I've been Catholic since my baptism, my whole life, but there's something so good to see those witnesses in the written page. the questions range all over the place. Oh, but before we get off the book subject, the most recent one that I read on Mary, I know it's not profound theology. Matthew Kelly's books are very written to be very popular. I think of all of his books out there, his book on the Rosary is his best book. And if you're not familiar with that, it's probably also his least known book. It's kind of remarkable that way. But I just read that in January or February, and that was a great one with little meditations on each of the mysteries of the Rosary that I thought were really outstanding. So, another one for. Sorry, back to the all over the place. What did they make at the bakery?
It started with bread, and that happened in the 1950s. It was started by a monk who would make bread during World War II. He was serving, as a cook in the war, and he brought his recipe to the monastery, and they just started to hit off. The machinery and everything to make the bread grew up into, it's a major operation. And the machinery is older now, and it costs a lot to maintain. So they actually start to diversify their operation by looking at other ways to make money with less time. And so now they make things like biscotti, cheese crisps, and power bars and things like that. And all excellent stuff. Monksbread.com. Go visit them, order things, ship right to your door. I'll give them a plug.
The cinnamon raisin bread makes some of the best French toast going. So if you're ever in the mood,
that's right.
You had a phrase of the point of the monk is to give praise to God. I think that's sort of uncharted territory for folks. First of all, just to reflect on monastic life in general, but I don't know. I think in what it means to praise God, or how a monk's life does that. But I think in all of this, like, how is my life today? It's nice to talk about a monk's life. Okay, maybe I can see that, but what does it mean that my life is, any of our lives are meant to praise God? Could you speak more to that?
Well, I think the best way I like to just approach that is just the fact that, we are just fundamentally relational, interrelational. We, not just with other people, but with things, with matter. And it's matter which supports us and sustains us. We all know right now how trying it is with people not having access to the food that they need. And we understand as a society that we have to do something about that. And I think that, whenever we are able to just turn that faucet and water comes out, that's a great moment of prayer. That's a great opportunity to say thank you. If it doesn't happen in these very little ways, then it's never going to happen in any type of big way. You'll never be happy when you get like a big raise and thank God for that necessarily. You'll think like, oh, the raise wasn't enough, or I need more. But when you're able to be so appreciative of the fact that you are so radically dependent upon everything around you just to exist, that is a great way to be able to cultivate an attitude of gratitude, so to speak, this way of giving thanks to God. This is why you hear these great stories, and I was exposed to these stories from my earliest days working with the poor. Like, the poor were so grateful for the little that they had. They weren't thinking like, oh, I wish I had this, I wish I had that. It was just in the moment being thankful for what they had. And that's something that we can still do in the tomb, so to speak, right now. We still, just the amazing technologies that we have that we're able to use in very meaningful ways right now, rather than just in very distracting ways. I think that we can be thankful for the fact that we have these opportunities to be able to meet like this. So I don't think you can ever be too over thankful. I think it's impossible, because every single thing that you're doing is only possible because of a God whose love allows you to do it. There's nothing else. There's no other reason. Being aware of that is completely cultivating a prayer of thanksgiving, a prayer of praise.
That can be a little jarring for a secular worldview. I don't know, being out of New York, whether the news of Governor Cuomo made its way in your direction, but he made a very bold statement about New York that when we started lowering the curve, flattening the curve, that this was something that we did. This was not something that God did. And I don't want to get into politics, of course, but I do think that what he was saying was something that was sort of betraying an understanding of God that is not that which can be praised in all things. Why would you praise God for flowing water, for drinkable water, for technology, all those things? He didn't plumb the pipes. He didn't. Yeah, he's not Bill Gates. Why do we thank God in those moments? I'm sorry, I'm talking. Well, what do you got for that?
Well, I mean, I just think that we can reconcile when people say things like that. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think we could say, yeah, we did what we could to, make this virus less deadly than predicted, but we can just add with the grace of God. I mean, like that's simply how I think we have to realize this. I mean, people will say certain things and they'll mean things in a certain way, but I think that, once again, we can't obsess with how people say things or why they say things the way we say, but we can understand from a certain standpoint that it's always through the grace of God that we're able to do anything good. And I think even for the most secular person, they realize that their life is so utterly dependent upon other things around them and other people. And they have to, if they're not essentially directly thanking God for that, they can be thankful for the fact that there's other things in the world, namely people, who are helping to keep them safe. I think we all have a great spirit of Thanksgiving right now for all our medical workers, for example. I mean, every day at 7 o'clock, we all stand out and we cheer. And to me, that's a prayer. I mean, we're thanking God as much as we're thanking, the medical profession. We can just always transfer this into like thanking God for allowing people to have the ability to take on these types of vocations where they serve the needs of others. So I don't really like to kind of get too down the path of why people say what they say and how they can say it. I mean, when you have an awareness of God's presence, you can very easily recognize that everything that we are able to do that's good in this world is only possible because of a loving God who gives us the opportunity to do it.
That's a great perspective. Thank you. I think that's good for us all to hear. That look to the positive thing that is being said, even if it's being said in a confrontational way. There's a truth that's behind it, that we do have to be thankful for those around us as well. Jen and Jeff, I'm not sure who was typing, but I assume it's going to be a tag team question. Want to know, how do you suggest we respond to people we encounter who do just want to go back to quote unquote normal? How do you lovingly challenge them, especially those who might not be all that interested in their faith yet?
Well, I often like to think about, when our life was normal before, were we happy? And just try to ask someone that question. Like, were you fully 100% happy with your life the way it was before? And no one could say yes to that, first off, And I think the thing is, when you're able to understand what you were not satisfied with in the way that we were living our life before, we can use this way as an opportunity to try to see, is there a way to somehow reconcile that part of your life or address that part of your life during this current time? So, I mean, yeah, we can all look at, I mean, there's been times in my life where I was like, oh, high school, those were such great days, or college, they were such great shit. But then when you think about it, like, no, they weren't really that great. I mean, there were a lot of problems, and I mean, as much as we yearn to go to the past, it's really a past that's really a fabrication in our mind as to what we think was so great about it. Yeah, I mean, there's certain things that were very good that we're missing right now, namely going to church, right? I mean, like, so clearly there are things that we're missing that were objectively good and that we desire to have again. But there were clearly things in our previous life, so to speak, that were not good. And how can this time now, this time in the tomb, so to speak, be a way to try to clear our mind, deaden ourselves to those things that were causing maybe a certain type of unhappiness, to try to make room for the surprise of how to emerge from the tomb with those things not being an issue anymore.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. It's I think you've tapped something in my mind right now. Like, what were you missing? What are you missing? Because there was always something that was missing. To look back to the line of Augustine, our hearts are restless until they really rest in you, not just rest in whatever convenience that you would like to have, but until they ultimately rest in you. It's a good thing for us all to reflect on. Your goddaughter broke my heart. Just make it real personal. I got to see her at a safe distance, and you know what a good hugger she is. And
I know. She's the best.
And then had to stop.
Yes, right.
Oh, and
right.
Just that, like, oh, this stinks.
Right.
But I think there's something profound and spiritual about that reality. Like, okay, I don't want to keep safe distance from. I don't want to live a virtual life with God. What I experience there with this unadulterated joy in life, is just a foretaste of my ultimate heavenly embrace with God.
But see, once again, that is a perfect example of how the tomb is the time for this enlargement of our desire. We could say with theological certainty that the separation between the Father and the Son at the moment of Christ dying on the cross was the greatest, right? But that is like that's the most profound way we can understand God's love, because of this profound separation, because the longing to be united is so great. As they always say, distance makes the heart grow fonder. I mean, that's very real. I mean, so this time where we're not together, I mean, this is expanding our heart's desires for amazing things. I mean, like, how can you look at this as being somehow problematic? Because the more expansive our desire becomes, the more space we're making for it to receive that love, which ultimately comes from God, but will manifest itself through people and through other things in the created world. And I do believe that we're able to allow this expansion of our desire to be something that to prepare us ultimately for heaven. So really this time, as much as it's preparing us for the next phase of our earthly life, this is doing light years for our time to be able to fully expand our desire to receive the fullness of God in the heavenly realm.
That's excellent. We're going to go from one of those beautiful 30,000 foot views with some real profound reflection to a real practical question. This is from Marco, who says, with so many people alone at this point, what's the one thing you can share with us? I'll let you do more than one if you want, but Marco only wants your number one from your 3 months in the monastery that can help these people.
Yeah. Well, first off, I have to be honest. I never really felt I was alone in the monastery. I mean, if there was a time where you just always felt you were with people, it was in the monastery. So much so that you were searching for ways to be on your own, Loneliness is a tremendous issue, especially in American culture. I mean, I was able to constantly see that when I was working in a parish and just going on sick calls. I mean, it's just tremendous how people live in our world, you know, and how to deal with loneliness now. Once again, I think it all goes back to everything we've already been talking about. Can we use this as an opportunity to go deeper in our thoughts? Can we use this as an opportunity to think deeper about the countless other people that we know throughout history, especially throughout the Christian tradition, who had to go through tremendous times by themselves? These people help the body, so to speak. We're all interconnected. Pope Francis does a great job always emphasizing that. There is this sense that, like, even when we are apart, even when we're alone, we have the inspiration of other people who've gone through the same type of experience. But most importantly, we have the experience of God himself going through this experience. There was nothing more lonely than Christ being on the cross. This is why Christianity is so transformative compared to any other type of religious worldview, because we don't look to God as being some type of magician or some God who's a Superman. We look to a God who becomes so lowly that he actually becomes one of us, and not just one of us, but also experience the very things that scare us the most, that threaten us the most, that bring us the most fear, namely being alone, namely suffering, namely death. So, if there's ever a time to able us to be united to the reality of who Christ is on the cross, it's now. And this really goes for all of us. So, in a certain sense, I understand that, you can't just look at our time being lonely as being this really happy time. But to know when you gaze upon a crucifix, which is why our Catholic churches emphasize them, is because we have a God who doesn't just give us the magic potion to make things better, but is completely with us. So I would say right now that the most practical thing a person who's lonely can do is to just find an image of Christ on the cross and hold onto it. And I think that something as simple as that can be very transformative.
And I know that in my own life, where I'm at in my faith, is that something that you would recommend for helping another individual? So say my neighbor's alone. I'm guessing your recommendation wouldn't just be to drop a crucifix off at their door.
Well, no. The reality is, like, every person is unique, and I think that's why the key thing that we have to do as people who are monastics right now, contemplatives, is that we have to listen. I think that there's a great tendency on our part to think that when we know who a person, let's say a neighbor, like you said, who's living by themselves,
Right.
we think we know what they need in order for them to feel better. So like we would think, like, I should call them more, or I should, like, bring them food every day, or I should, get them to meet other people, or to join Facebook or something like that. Like we like want to have these solutions as to how to remedy the loneliness. And I don't think that's what we're called to do with people, to try to fix them that way. I'm always taken by the story of Jesus, his encounter with the blind man who's calling out to him. So the guy's blind, he's calling out to Jesus. And the first thing that Jesus says to him, he's like, what do you want me to do for you? Now, here's Jesus, God. You think, like, oh, well, can't you see he's blind? He wants to see. Well, Jesus doesn't just assume that's what the man wants, So he takes the time to allow the person to express what it is he's seeking. And I think that when we hear people being alone and we can feel sorry for them, I don't think, like, they don't want our pity. Right. I think what they want is the ability to be heard. And if there's one thing that God is good at doing, is listening to us. He puts up with a lot of us screaming, yelling, complaining about things. Think about the Israelites in the desert. They were always complaining about what God was up to and doing. And God can deal with it. And I think the more that we allow ourselves to yield to the presence of Christ in us, we become a better listener, who can honestly say, what do you want me to do for you? Rather than think, like, I know what you need, I'm going to fix you. Bringing the crucifix over to your neighbor that would be me thinking like, I know what this person needs, I'm going to give them it. And, like, that's just not how it's work.
Thank you. That right there, I know this wasn't a pay-per-view, but that was worth the cost of admission. Just listening. When I'm calling parishioners these days, just cold calling folks, what I've found the most effective question to ask them is, how was your Easter?
Yeah, it's great.
Just to let them start talking. In many cases, it was quiet, and then it opens the door to, but my kids live down the street, and it was wonderful being able to do that. Or it was awful because there was absolutely nobody, but there was the technology, so at least I was able to Zoom or whatever it is. So yeah, to listen, like the Lord. I got a couple others for you here. I guess you have I'm sorry I missed this. You posted a beautiful article on grieving. How do we grieve well now that we're in the tomb?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everyone grieves their own way. I mean, there's no right way to grieve necessarily, but I think that grieving helps us to truly understand what we were thankful for in the past, but at that time we weren't thankful. I think that's why we grieve. It's because like we didn't appreciate what we had when we had it, you know. And I think that right now we're able to, you know, double down on our attitude of gratitude by being able to grieve. I mean, grieving is really an opportunity to give thanks. So I think that's the best way to grieve well, because of the fact that grieving badly, let's put it this way, would be kind of saying this person or this thing or this event or this opportunity is no longer in my life. Woe is me. My life now is ruined and I won't find joy anymore. I mean, grieving that way is not an opportunity to be healed. Grieving that way is a way to kind of devolve into really narcissism, or thinking that everything has to surround around me. But to grieve well is to have this great appreciation for what we did have and that we don't have. And also to grieve well is to let go of the things that we had in the past that were not good. So the grieving process can work on being able to recognize what was good and to essentially continue that in our life in some way of being appreciative to, and to grieve the things that are not going to come back to us, nor should they. To really say, I'm done with that. And that's a good thing, because now I'm decluttering my life for something new.
Again, openness. There's the space. Space to receive God.
Yeah.
We've got 2 more. If I think we've got time for, but they're doozies. So let's see if
right.
see what we can do here.
Bring them on. Let me get some water for this one.
Very good. All right. In your time in the monastery, did you find yourself frustrated by something, or did you find yourself frustrated by something in the monastery or in yourself that didn't meet your expectations? Or
sorry.
Was there some? I'm sorry. So, if so, was there a learning experience in turning this frustration into something constructive?
Yeah, well, first off, I think there was nothing about being in the monastery that I didn't necessarily like. I mean, being a person who kind of likes being on a schedule and likes manual work and really does like to pray, all those components gel with me in a very amazing way. The thing I was most surprised about during my time in monasteries, I didn't feel as contemplative as I thought I would be. And I think that was the thing that was the most surprising to me. And the novice master there, we were pretty close. I would often say to him, you know, or he would say to me, he's like, well, John, it's like, I think that you definitely are a monastic, but you're trying to discern whether you're meant to be a monastic in a monastery or a monastic in the world. You know, that's why you're spending time here. And I've heard people say things like that to me prior to me going to the monastery. But it didn't really connect until I was there, when I was realizing that the contemplative, or my means of contemplation, didn't necessarily sync with the life in the monastery. For example, one thing that's really brought me a lot of joy in recent years is photography. I mean, I feel very contemplative when I'm able to, just be so present to things, and I can capture it in a photograph. And that was something I was not doing at all in the monastery. I mean, I did have opportunities here and there, but it was not something that was, at my disposal. And also, there's certain times where, I really, like, especially when I was in California, I would love being in nature for a long time. I mean, just going on long hikes, or spending time in, in the ocean, or in the mountains and the redwoods. I mean, it was like, I was just so captivated by nature. And while Genesee, where I was absolutely beautiful, it was a very limited amount of time that you were able to spend in the woods. I mean, like, the bell would ring and you had to get back. And so there wasn't like this way to just kind of delve into there. I mean, I think I was able to understand a little bit more of, like, the frustrations of guys like Thomas Merton, who would talk about these things. I have a great affinity for Merton, but I think I understood him even a little bit more in my short time in the monastery because of that frustration. So interestingly enough, it wasn't because the monastery offered a life that was incompatible with my personality. It was the contemplative aspect, which is why I was going there to foster, that I felt was coming up short. And I think a lot of it also comes from my just experience of becoming a contemplative in the context of being with people, namely the poor. I mean, Mother Teresa was the most profound contemplative around, because she would always recognize that Jesus was in the poor. She was contemplating God in who she was serving. So, like, that is just as fervent as if you were in adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament. It's the same thing. I know that people will probably, challenge me on that, but it really is the same thing. And the first person to say would be someone like Mother Teresa, where you're able to behold the hiddenness of Jesus Christ in the poor. And that's a contemplative moment, just like you're able to behold the hiddenness of Jesus Christ in the consecrated host. So that dynamism there is something that I think that I was craving as a contemplative.
It's not the either or, but the both and in Catholicism, which is such a blessing. I told you there was one more. I've got an old vocations director's heart, Brother John. I can't help myself. There was one that came in at the 11th hour. Can you discern? So this is one, and then one more, the big finish, and then I'm cutting them off after this, all right? Because I'm like that. Mm-hmm. Can you compare your discernment to the priesthood to your discernment to the monastic life? Clearly, you felt and still feel called to be a priest, not a monk. Can you describe that in your own life?
So can I describe the difference? Say it again. It kind of chopped up a little bit, so I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you compare your discernment to the priesthood to your discernment to monastic life? You felt and still feel called to be a priest, but not a monk. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever you're feeling called by God, there's something very similar that's happening, meaning that you're clearly at doing one thing with your life, and you realize there's something that's not fulfilling, and you're trying to listen really to what's around you, and ultimately you're trying to listen to God through what's around you, through the different people who speak to you and whatnot, that allows you to then continue some type of vocational discernment. So, I think clearly, if I remember what finally put me over the hurdle to become a priest, because I was on the fence for a very long time, and I'm sure a lot of these people on this call know about my very, very long and winding road to the priesthood. But the thing is that, like, there came to be a point where it's like, something, nothing else is going to make me happy other than being a priest. And so I responded, and I've not regretted that decision, of course, at all. And I think in my spiritual life too, there comes to be this point where it's like, nothing is going to make me more happy than intimacy with Christ. I mean, like, that's basically what it comes to. And the reality is, like, I still feel that way. Nothing is going to make me happy other than intimacy with Christ. Nothing. And so therefore you start opening up the door to, okay, well, how's that intimacy going to come about? And monastic life seemed to be something that was pulling me to explore that intimacy, going down that path. Now, I mean, for all I know, I mean, like, maybe it's just not the right time. Maybe this is gonna, maybe because maybe I'm supposed to be where I am right now because just of where we are in the tomb in the world right now, right? I mean, maybe this will show up again some other time. But the key thing that ultimately connects, I would say, a vocation to the priesthood or vocation to any type of life is just like, nothing is really going to fulfill you unless you are doing exactly what you're made to do, because that's where your intimacy with Christ happens. Because that's, as Merton would say, that is your true self being lived. That's your true self being lived. So I'm constantly desiring to be my true self. I don't want to be caught up in the superficialities of the false self. And I'd be the first to say that I am nowhere near that. I mean, I often think about this every time I post something on Facebook. I'm always thinking, oh, what do I want people to think about me when I post this photo or this article? I mean, it happens all the time. So, I'm constantly in the shadow of my false self. And when I kind of just, straighten myself, I'm like, oh, but this is not really what I want. I mean, I ultimately want to be living my intimacy with Christ. And so it was just part of going down that path of trying to see where that intimacy lies.
And you've set yourself up perfectly. I'm not giving any other intro. Intimacy with Christ leads perfectly into Ava's question. Can you talk about, quote unquote, resting in God and contemplative prayer? What that looked like in the monastery and also now?
Yeah. Resting in God. I think I think the best thing I could say is it's just really what it says it is, being at rest. And I don't mean this in some type of like goofy, corny way, but being able to just be so present to the moment that you don't want to be in any other moment than that moment. And that to me is resting in God. And that's possible at any time. So like, that's being at rest when you realize, like, I don't want this moment to be any other moment. Now, granted, that can be very difficult when you're in the middle of something that's very, very challenging. When someone is dying, let's say, and you can't see them in the hospital because they're dying of this, I mean, who wants to be able to say that that's the moment you want to be in? But to be able to rest in God in that moment is that even in that moment where you wish it was something else, that it was another way, that you somehow are open to some mysterious peace that surpasses understanding, grace that goes beyond measure. And that ultimately is resting in God, when you are completely aware that the present moment, no matter how difficult it may be, is the only moment where God is going to give you everything you need to be able to not just get through it, but to somehow even find peace in it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any they're done with their questions, but I want to make sure that you didn't have something that is, do you have anything that you want to tie things up with? You've done a beautiful presentation that you don't have to, but if there's something that you had on your heart that we should have asked you, or that you just want to make sure to highlight or put an exclamation point before, I want to give you that chance before we sign off.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I would share with you is just some practical stuff. I mean, like, I don't like to necessarily tell people what to do, but I can just tell you what's been working for me right now during this time. I think that, and I know this is gonna sound silly, but they're very practical things. But like, going to bed at a consistent time each night has done major wonders for me. In fact, I set an alarm for a time for me to go to bed rather than setting an alarm for me a time to wake up. Because it's actually been a transformative thing. Also, I've been finding so much more joy in reading newspapers and like watching like the nightly news, like the 6:30 news, because it just kind of contains the intake of news to a very, very, something with parameters. So, we can go down rabbit holes when we're online. And having just the daily, the paper has been actually a very great way to, as I like to say, it's all the news that's fit to print, but it's also all the news that's fit to love for the day. So it's a way to kind of keep focus on things that you can love and pray for. So, and the other thing too is just carving out time to just be totally okay being quiet. I mean, I just think that we can really fear this time by thinking that we're not going to have like things that are going to stimulate us in some type of way. I mean, I realize this is very difficult for families of young children. But to be able to live silence, maybe in those moments, by not just expecting everything to be the way they're supposed to be, by constantly, I don't know, yelling at your kids or whatever it may be, to just in a few moments to just say, okay, I could open my mouth, but I'm going to close my mouth. And I think that's a way to be able to be silent even in the midst of lots of noise, because when you close your mouth, you are actually practicing silence. So, I realize this is a very difficult time. We're on uncharted territory for all of us. There is no right way to live this time necessarily, but I do think that it is an opportunity for us to grow and to expand our desires, to receive what God wants to give us, and little practical things that make sense, that are not going to because if you set the bar too high, it just doesn't work. So I mean, I think it's just little things that can actually allow God's mystery to unfold, because that's exactly how God works. He always starts small and then it ends up being big. I mean, this whole thing that we call Christianity began with one man, in an area of the world that's the size of New Jersey in Israel.
Right.
And now it's transformed everything. So it's the same way in our life. I mean, if you can just double down on one little thing, God graces that, and then it grows.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Hey,
I'm
thank
going
you.
to take the spotlight off you there for
Sure.
just a plug. I'm going to ask you to do a closing prayer to send us on our way in just a second, Father John. But before we do that, just a plug for next week. We've got Doctors Larry and Dr. Carmina Chap who will be coming to present to us. Friends of yours, from what I understand, Father John.
Very dear friends. Yeah.
Theologian farmers. These are my first theologian farmers. I'm kind of excited to meet. I know a lot of farmers and a lot of theologians, so this is the first hybrid model that I've found, with a lot of work with Catholic worker movement and good background with Dorothy Day. So, and I'm just appreciating coming in the midst of this new normal for us. How will we? I'm sure there's a lot that they're going to be able to share for us in their appreciation for the Lord, but also for coming back to nature in a real remarkable way. So stay tuned for that. That's next week.
I can guarantee you will not be
Sorry?
No, I was going to say, I can guarantee you will not be disappointed with the presentation next week. So definitely come back. You're going to love it. As everyone knows, Larry. Yeah.
Do us a favor, send us on our way with a prayer, if you would, and then I'm going to unmute everybody because they like to have a chance to say thank you and on their way out. Okay.
Okay. Cool. So we can just close our eyes for a moment. Oh God, you are the giver of all good gifts. We thank you for this moment of silence when we can experience your love for us through the breath that we take. Help us to stay connected to that funnel of your love for each of us, and help us to then be able to expand that funnel and see your love in everything that we behold. We make this our prayer in your Son's name, Jesus. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much, Father Don.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys.
Take care.
Have a good night.
Thank
you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Father Grib.
Much. God bless you, everybody.
Okay.
God bless.